We are here today with Professor Moeller from Carefree Wandering, which is a wonderful channel that I recommend everyone to go and check out if you haven't done so already. And thank you very much for joining me in this conversation.
My pleasure.
We've spoken before, but that was in the early days of the podcast. I wanted to talk to you again because I've recently covered some Eastern philosophy on my channel, mainly spring and autumn period philosophers, the different ways that the term Tao is used by Confucius and Mencius and
Right.
Xunzi, Lao Tzu, and Zhuangzi. And I've recently done a video comparing Zhuangzi to Nietzsche. But before we get into that comparative aspect, I just wanted to start out with some questions about Zhuangzi and Eastern philosophy more
Mm.
generally. And I know this is a big question to start with, but Zhuangzi is usually referred to as a Daoist philosopher. And there's some contention about this. I mean, some have suggested Taoism is perhaps like an oversimplified term or even a construct. How do you view Zhuangzi in this respect? Is it meaningful to class him as a Taoist? Is that a meaningful category? And just overall, where do you see him fitting in to the story of Chinese philosophy?
Well, first of all, yes, I do think it's a useful category. And I do think there is a very explicit, partly also implicit connection between the Zhuangzi as a text and the Laos of the Tao Te Ching as a text. So a lot of the, let's say, clues that the Zhuangzi works with come from the Lao Tzu Tao Te Ching. There's a very complex textual history. Both texts were probably not written at one time by one person, so they have very complex history. But generally, and there was also a debate about this, which text is earlier, which is later, which again is very complicated because there is not one text which was written at one time. But nevertheless, I do see the Zhuangzi, let's say, in the tradition of the Laos of the Tao Te Ching, which is, I think, rightfully seen as the core text of the Taoist tradition. So I do think there is historical and philological strong evidence for constructing this kind of lineage from the Lao Tzu to the uh, Zhuangzi, and then later to a very, very broad Taoist tradition. And one of the core of this Taoist tradition then become these two central texts. So both in Chinese, in the history of Chinese philosophy as well as in the history of Chinese religion, we often see these texts regarded as central to what then other people do with them, either philosophically or religiously. And of course, there are no strong boundaries. There are also no strong, clear boundaries between philosophy and religion. And there is not something like, a clear-cut boundary between Daoism and Confucianism and Buddhism and all the other schools throughout the history. There is not really like you're not one, either one or the other. But nevertheless, I think there is enough kind of traditional, let's say, again, lineage to speak of something like a Taoist tradition. So that it makes sense for me to classify the Zhuangzi as a Taoist text. In addition to that, it is also very clear that in the Zhuangzi there is a lot of critique of Confucius and then Confucianism. Well, some scholars also say there is not really such thing as Confucianism. That's what scholars do. That's how they make a career.
Right.
But nevertheless, it is very, very obvious that in the Zhuangzi itself, there's often a dichotomy between Taoist and Confucian positions, between Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, and sometimes between Lao Tzu and Kongzi, but sometimes Confucius is himself that's the irony. Used as a spokesperson for Taoist positions, but nevertheless, this kind of um, let's say, yeah, dialectical relation between Taoist positions and Confucianist traditions is a main theme in the Zhuangzi, a very main theme. And that's another reason why I think it makes sense to classify the Zhuangzi as part of the Taoist tradition.
What would you say is the main for if somebody had no understanding at all or background in Eastern philosophy, the main way that you would distinguish Taoism from the Confucian strands of thought? Like, how would you describe their critique?
Confucianism, there are many things I could say, but you're asking about one main thing, and one main thing is probably the anthropocentrism and the non-anthropocentrism. So Confucianism highlights very much anthropocentric ideas. So that one thing is, for instance, the distinction between humans and animals and other things in the natural world, which is very central to the whole, let's say, Confucian idea of civilization. And then we have a very strong focus on the family as the kind of unit where human life that human life is kind of grounded in a, if we want to use a modern term, family values. Of course, I don't use exactly this term, but
Right.
you can say that both Confucian moral thinking, ethics, as well as its political philosophy, are grounded on the family and the human family as like a central idea. And we don't have that in Daoism. We have actually in the Zhuangzi some very kind of critiques of looking at the family as kind of the standard way of human life. But generally, there is the human world and the human realm is not seen as somehow privileged over the non-human realm. And I think that's a very striking difference to begin
Yeah.
with. And then many of the other differences kind of follow up on this basic difference. So that would be my answer. If you want me to narrow it down to one thing, then
Right.
I'd mention the anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism issue.
Right, right, right. Confucius doesn't ask about the horses after the fire in the stable. He's only
Sure.
concerned about the
Yes.
human world. Is there a story? I'm trying to think of a story or something from the Zhuangzi that sort of critiques the family roles or something like that. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yes, and I like the Robert Zhu chapter. I sometimes like to
Mm.
translate it as Gangster Zhu, which is among the later chapters in the book, chapter 29, I think. And but actually, there's good reason to believe that it is one of the earliest and core chapters of the text in the Zhuangzi. And there we have this protagonist, very kind of interesting figure. This gangster or is a gang leader. He is like a big time criminal in early China. Is this kind of large group of yeah, they are whatever, like some sort of little criminal
Like
army
bandits or
and
something like that?
bandits. Yes, yes,
Yeah.
something like that. And so Confucius visits him and tries to somehow convert him or actually bribe him to become part of the established feudal elite. And the Robager doesn't like that and is exposing Confucius' hypocrisy. And in the context of exposing Confucius' hypocrisy, he also very much critiques the, let's say, Confucian civilization story that I already referred to in my first reply to your question, the anthropocentrism, non-anthropocentrism thing. So and by Robert Joe or Gangster Joe proposes basically an alternative civilization story, saying the whole kind of Confucian civilization is basically a negative form of civilization story. Instead of increasing well-being, it has just brought about immense suffering and slaughter and corruption. At the beginning of this anti-civilization story told by Robert Joe is like one sentence which I very much like, where he says, like, I'm just quoting from memory, not exactly. In the old days, humans lived among the animals, among the deer, and they woke up somewhere and then they slept at different places. They woke up and slept at different places every day. And they knew their mothers, but didn't know their fathers.
Got it. Okay.
And that, of course, means there was no family. And there was
Right.
not the father-son relations. And the whole Confucian ethics is built on these five core relations, starting with the husband and the wife and the father and the son. So that is like an egregious, preposterous kind of claim to pose this to Confucius, to challenge this kind of the family as the beginning, as the core of the whole kind of Confucian project. And so that is for me a very important textual passage. That, you know, in the old days when people were still living in harmony with the natural world, they knew their mothers, but they didn't know their fathers. So it's basically no family.
Right. Yeah. There's also, I think, something in there that a theme I noticed in the Zhuangzi is the Confucians always have this impulse. We have to go bring them into the Confucian project. We have to go teach everyone virtue and instruct them.
Right.
And it seems as though that story also cuts against that because Robert G is
Exactly.
saying you've made everyone worse by doing this, by
Yes,
ordering the family and all that.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's to again use a contemporary Western term. Confucianism is very paternalistic in a very literal sense, with the emphasis on the role of the father.
Mhm.
And that has also this kind of educational, not really missionary, but as you said, there's always kind of this educational instruction is very this emphasis on instruction. And Daoism also argues very much against that. And you know, its main figures don't really instruct, and they
Mm.
regard this whole kind of instruction domestication. That's another word that I like to use, right? Again, the paternalistic the very strong paternalistic aspect of Confucianism also goes along with a very strong emphasis on domestication. And domestication, the word comes from the Latin word for house, which has to do with household, right? And that has to do again with the civilization process, right? You have to domesticate animals, but which is a big, big theme in the Zhuangzi, right? The harm that is done to animals by domesticating and the violence in it. That already brings us to Nietzsche and the violence that is done to humans by this same kind of paternalistic and domesticational regime that Confucianism represents. So I would read large parts of the Zhuangzi, but which the roots for this are definitely already in the Laozi as a critique of the Confucian paternalistic and domestication regime. That's basically my reading of the Zhuangzi.
Yeah, my mind went to Nietzsche as well there, thinking about him talking about, these moralities of taming human beings.
Exactly.
And and with Nietzsche, he gives a particularly violent story as to how we tame human beings.
Exactly. Yes,
And
that is so Zhuangzian. That
mhm,
is one of the biggest parallels between Zhuangzi and Nietzsche. It's a
interesting.
very, very strong parallel.
Yeah, it's because he is rather explicit that or Nietzsche is rather explicit that it is a violent process and one in which, um, I mean, if you really get into the weeds with it, the whole regulative moral regime is trying to create this neutral substratum, as he says, of between the doer and the deed, which Nietzsche thinks makes everyone worse. So it is a very similar story to the
Yes,
Taoist story. But
yes,
I guess this brings me to the question because one of the things I really love about your talks about Taoism is that in the West, when we approach these texts, many people are looking for some sort of mystical or metaphysical, um, some sort of experience in that vein. But you often speak about the political and the ethical dimensions. And so, given everything that we've said so far, what do you think are the political or the ethical implications of a Zhuangzian approach? Because I could see, and I know given the style of the Zhuangzi and how he is, it would be very difficult to pin down one definite answer on this. But I could see that you could read many things out of it. Is he aiming for anarchy? Is he aiming for some sort of Daoist society? Does he have no such goal? Um, what would you see the practical implications being if we were to take Zhuangzi's claim to heart that this regime is making everyone worse?
Um, on the one hand, I'm very glad you saw that and pointed that out, that I very much try to emphasize the socio-political critiques in the Zhuangzi and to de-emphasize the mystical metaphysical readings. That doesn't mean that I think they're not legitimate. They are
Right.
legitimate. But I think there are other levels in the text that, at least to me, are actually more interesting and more, let's say, unique, or not unique is the wrong word. More that's where the Zhuangzi is somehow more interesting. Let's put it like this, and also more subtle. And yeah, um, so. I do not think, this being said, I do not think that there is something like some form of coherent political philosophy in the Zhuangzi. It's not really promoting any form of, let's say, government or social organization. It's basically a critique, as I already said, of, let's put it like in a larger context. In my reading, basically, the main distinction that guides early Chinese philosophy is the distinction between order and disorder. And basically, all philosophical schools claim that they know some, or that they teach some methods for ordering society, and in both a political and an ethical way. And the Zhuangzi is basically a form of cultural critique and also social political critique that critiques specifically the Confucian vision of order. And as I already said, and there's many passages in the Zhuangzi that say that explicitly, that the Confucian claim that they kind of spread order politically, ethically, is wrong. They actually spread disorder, and society is in a very overall bad shape and that which is actually historical fact, right? A lot of people are there's lots of wars, and a lot of people are suffering greatly. And so it's that is, I think, the first kind of, again, very Nietzschean, a kind of challenge of the master narratives, and that the whole vocabulary that is used and that has very much a strong the function of justifying the political and socioeconomic regimes of the time, that they are all big lies that the people like to tell themselves. And there is a strong emphasis, I think, directly and indirectly, for instance, in the Robert Jure chapter, very explicitly, on the suffering that is caused by the regimes at the time, and which is supported by the Confucian narratives, by the Confucian ethical systems, and so forth. So in this sense, I see this as like a major intent behind especially the Zhuangzi, but also the Laozi, to critique the dominant socio-political structures and, let's say, their legitimization through the dominant philosophical narratives at the time. There is, which is often ignored nowadays or completely ignored, there was a interesting Marxist interpretation of Daoism, which is how I learned Daoist philosophy when I was in
Oh,
China
really?
in the 1980s for 2 years. And I first learned in depth about studying Daoism at a Chinese university, being taught in Chinese, and we still use the Chinese textbooks, which were all from the 1970s and so forth. And that was a purely dialectical materialism, right? That is how all of the history of Chinese philosophy was interpreted, through this Marxist Maoist lens. And
That sounds
they didn't really know
fascinating. That
yes, and
sounds
it's actually
incredible.
I have a student writing his PhD thesis about this, and It's a shame that this is kind of completely dismissed nowadays. Not just in the West, it's simply neglected. In China, it's also not, not no one really wants to talk about it. And for several reasons. And of course, I mean, it is in many ways problematic, this kind of Marxist reception, because they were clearly following also the political guidelines. And nevertheless, I think this Marxist reading, I'm not fully convinced by it, but I do think it has one very strong advantage over most other readings, including the metaphysical and the mystical readings, that it puts it into historical context, which I think is super important. Also, coming from my German background, right? We do philosophy, basically, we approach philosophy like Nietzsche did, historically. And so to completely ignore this, which is done both from the metaphysical, mystical perspective, as well as from the now increasing analytic perspective, now in the academic realm, many scholars just read the Zhuangzi analytically.
Mhm.
And so the dominant approach to the Zhuangzi is not historical. So that I think is a major strength of the historical of the Marxist dialectical materialist approach. And so it reads Zhuangzi completely embedded in, let's say, the socio-political conflicts at the time. And then they're not really sure. They move back and forth between calling Daoism progressive or not progressive. They're not really sure how they want to do it, right? Are the Daoists somehow the defenders of the revolting suppressed farmer class? Or do they want to revert back to history, to some kind of imaginary kind of pre-feudal utopian society? So the question is, are they progressive or not? And there are different answers given to that. But generally, this approach to understand Taoism as opposing the feudalistic Confucian system at the time, I think makes perfect sense, actually. What you exactly then do with it and what vocabulary you use to explain that and how exactly you analyze the text is another question. But this general approach has had a strong influence on my reading of the Zhuangzi. So I do see, especially the Zhuangzi, but also the Lao Tzu in that context, in that concrete socio-political context, as opposing what I already discussed, the political and socio-economic structures and the narratives supporting them at the time. That is, for me, fundamental to approaching the text.
Right. I guess if I could just push a little further on this though, because it sounds like they don't necessarily come down on one side or the other as to whether or not the or Taoist philosophy in general is like revolutionary. It's situated in a certain time and place. It could be critical of the feudal system, but there's also passages where, especially in Lao Tzu, it seems like it's almost, I dare I say, Rousseauian romantic. I think of the idea of
Exactly.
the two
Yes.
small villages who are barely aware of one another,
Yes,
small scale
exactly. Yeah.
society and stuff like that. And so I guess what maybe this would be a way to get at it is there a valid sort of revolutionary reading of Zhuangzi? Because you could also read Zhuangzi as advocating for a kind of individualism and just sort of abdicating and walking away. And I guess, do you think either of those interpretations could be valid, or is there something, do you lean in one direction or the other?
First of all, I fully agree. Or let's say you're completely spot on here, that these are like the two competing readings of Taoism. The one revolutionary, and for instance, this robber Zhe or gangster Zhe during the Cultural Revolution, they were like
Oh,
paintings or
he's a
whatever,
hero?
drawings of him. No,
Wow.
he was like a leader of a peasant uprising. That's
Okay.
how he's represented, as a leader of a peasant
Mhm.
uprising. And so that would be the revolutionary reading of the text. But exactly as you said, then there are also these other readings that it is some form of individualistic escapism, romanticism, that parts of the feudal elites, they would just withdraw from life, and therefore it's not of the peasants, it's just some group among the ruling class that just has some form of bourgeois escapism, and therefore it doesn't really have revolutionary value. So there are these two readings, and exactly as you said, the second reading, the let's say um, um, escapist reading, that has very strong parallels to a major reading of Daoism until today, that has been much more influential in the West and was then reflected back to China, the individualism reading, right? And the kind of quietism, right? We don't really care about politics and about society. We're just about, having, getting some form of individual uh, how to say, making sure we are okay or something like this, and somehow
The being at
promoting
home
our
in the world.
uniqueness. Yes, and at the same time, preserving our uniqueness, right? And so that is this kind of that's the authenticity reading,
Yeah,
basically.
I was gonna say that's
And
yeah.
I mean, with Paul D'Ambrosi and I rewrote this book on genuine pretending. And the whole purpose of this book, well, not the whole purpose, but one main purpose of this book was to criticize this Western authenticity-based reading of Taoism and the Zhuangzi. And basically, we believe that this authenticity reading of the Zhuangzi, which is now very, very prevalent also in China, that this is basically came up in the age of authenticity in the West in the 18th, 19th, 20th century, when authenticity philosophy was dominating Western thought. And then this opposition to Confucianism and to the traditional, in our terms, sincerity, traditional society, that was then read as promoting authenticity and individualism. And the book Genuine Pretending was written with the intention to criticize that authenticity individualism reading, which dominates the Western non-Marxist perception of Taoism since the at least 19th century.
So to the extent that you would, because there are those aspects of the Zhuangzi about how when you become a certain role in society, in a way your potential is destroyed or something like this. I mean, I think of the one of my favorite passages, I think from the outer chapters, where somebody's asking Zhuangzi, "Do you want to hold office?" And he says, "Have you ever seen the sacrificial ox and how they feed it
Yes,
all this nice
exactly.
food and deck it out in honors?" But
Yes,
then, it gets sacrificed. Surprise, surprise, at the
yes,
end of the day.
yes,
And this is his analogy to what it is to sort of become a function of society to go in and
yes.
play this role. Am I correct in saying you would see that the framework that Zhuangzi is working from is more in the vein of this genuine pretending idea that you
Yes.
can sort of move from role to role. That this authenticity thing is like a later. It's like almost an anachronistic way to read the text. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Uh,
Perfect.
Also, this
Right.
story, I agree with I also like this story a lot. It's been paradigmatic already since the Han Dynasty. It is seen as representing, and I think rightly so, core ideas of the Zhuangzi, the sacrificial ox story. This story, though, also clearly has a political context, right? It's about taking part in the rulership and understanding that the rulership system, the feudal system, is murderous.
Mhm.
And so all these stories have a very, very concrete, most of the stories, if you look at them, you will see basically most of these stories have this very political context, direct political context that they all have to do with rulers and the court. and the feudal class.
Mm.
And again, that story too. And that the Western readings kind of deny that.
Mm.
Right? They
The
ignore that.
context, yeah.
And they only focus on the individualism thing. But the concrete setting of the stories, the actual meaning of the stories, is is primarily socio-political. And what underlies it philosophically, in our view, is not an individualistic escapist view, but the, let's say, existential subtext is genuine pretending, which means all these social roles, this is what we can see from, let's say, the fakeness and the theatralic form of this culture, that the Confucians are all genuinely pretending. And we should understand that all these, as you said, all our social identities are genuinely pretended. So that is the kind of the existential um, um,
Mm.
conclusion that we draw from this political critique.
Right. Well, there is a difference though, right? Or because there seems to be there's some critique of the Confucians perhaps over-identifying with the role,
Yes,
or okay, but
exactly.
okay, but there. So what is the difference between genuine pretending and disingenuous pretending, if I may ask, or is there
Yes,
is
I
there
mean,
some
as
concrete
you
way?
said, the clue is this identification with social roles. These can be roles in the family, but over identification, but also very much roles in this politics, let's say, right? In role as a ruler, that you have like a that you have like a some form of that your role is in the hierarchical structure and that you get your build your sense of self on the basis of your role within the hierarchical role structure, right? And that you then over identify with that sense of self. And I think that is the core critique we find in the Zhuangzi, that people build their sense of self and all their desires and all their yeah, desires is very important, and their thinking and their living is based on this is focused on these role identities, and that's what the Zhuangzi tries to deconstruct, and that's what the Zhuangzi regards as very unhealthy. And so this over identifying with one's role, which causes a lot of both psychological, existential, but also political harm, which because it not just manifests but intensifies these paternalistic structures. This again, it's part of the domestication, the critique of domestication, because domestication, the domos is the house, the family, and domestication process works by for humans by identifying with the roles they have in the household, and in the smaller sense and in the larger sense. So this kind of over identification with roles is this kind of orientation towards the hierarchical roles we have either in the literal household or in the larger
Right.
socio-political household. And this is, from the Zhuangzi perspective, Daoist perspective, causes a lot of stress and is somehow brings about a lot of suffering. So what we need to understand is that all the social roles we have are genuinely pretended. What does genuinely pretended mean? Pretending means they are a construct, they are a social construct. And we identify these roles like we do, and many sociologists, also modern Western sociologists, Goffman also, they have described this is how societies function, right? It's like in this kind of theatrical way that we play roles and then we play them and then we strongly identify with them and then they become genuine. So that's the meaning of genuine pretending, that identity is always and everyone is always genuinely pretending once they have a sense of self,
Right.
right? The sense of self is, of course, for the Confucians, they want to ignore the pretending part, right? They
Mm.
think, no, these identities are not. There's no pretense in it. This is what we really what really everything is about, and that's how it should be. So, and they pretend to be only genuine, so to speak,
Right.
right? Whereas from a Daoist perspective, we can see that our identification with, let's say, yeah, identity is genuinely pretended and cannot be otherwise. And therefore, we have many stories in the Zhuangzi that again deconstruct this strong sense of identity. The most representative is the most famous story of the Zhuangzi is the butterfly dream story, right? Again, also non-anthropocentrism, right? We have a butterfly, and we have that's a key theme in the Zhuangzi. Again, this non-anthropocentric, the transformation of all things, that everything is in a process of constant transformation, and that identities are subject to change, and that identities are temporary, and that there is nothing essential to them, and that the point is not to over identify with your identity, but to be more relaxed about your identity.
Mm.
And to be more relaxed about, if you're more relaxed about your identity and not over identify with it and understand that it is temporary and subject to change, and most importantly, genuinely pretended, then this can lead to a kind of an existential relaxation, but also to a socio-political, which is very important, relaxation,
Mm.
that you understand that roles are played, and then you can be generally more playful
Yeah.
rather than obsessed.
Right. I think a light bulb just went off for me because I'm realizing now, okay, this is why there's that Western individualist reading, because they're seeing the counter to the role is this authenticity thing, which, but if you read the Zhuangzi carefully, as you point out, there's this indeterminacy of identity and sort of
Yes,
a transformation of all things going on.
yes,
It's almost as like a working metaphysical operating
yes,
assumption. You can bet
yes,
that everything is going to change from moment to moment. Um,
yes, exactly.
yeah. Well, I
Very
guess this
Heraclitus-like,
indeed.
Heraclitus-like.
Yeah. Well, which is a perfect
Which brings us again to
pivot to
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I guess before we start comparing them, I know believe you said you're teaching a class on Nietzsche.
Yes, I'm
Um,
teaching the genealogy of morality. Actually, tonight. I'm teaching it this
oh, okay.
semester.
Yeah. I guess I would
Can
ask.
I go back
Oh,
to what
sure.
you said?
Sure, 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 sure.
Yeah, because you said this thing exactly. And I just want to confirm what you said, but then you
Okay.
went to a
Yeah, yeah,
different
yeah.
connect
Sorry, sorry,
direction.
sorry.
Uh, um, you said, yeah, the Westerners, they read it as authenticity because it's critiquing the sincere role identity. And that's exactly, I mean, our thesis, that this authenticity interpretation came about in the West in the 18th century, when in the
Mm,
West there was this criticism of sincerity, of traditional role identification. And that was not really seen, that was seen as conformity, as bad. And then we have this romanticism coming up as a critique of the traditional sincerity based ethics and politics. And then by default, they see other texts from other cultures that critique also role-based sincerity society, and they think, oh, it must be all about authenticity, right?
mm.
That's kind of the default reading that came from the Western age of authenticity, that just implied that any critique of this, what we call sincerity kind of structure, must be authenticity. But that's very obviously not the case. The like Buddhism and Taoism is about no self, no
Right,
identity, no authenticity. Nothing is authentic in the Western sense.
right. Right. There's no original. There's no thing in itself that you can
No.
falsify or something like that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And that's interesting to think of Nietzsche as well because you brought up the Romantics as part of this cult of sincerity or of authenticity in a way.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche begins as a romantic, but it becomes very, very critical of the Romantics, and I think on a
Exactly.
similar basis.
Yes.
Um,
Yes. Exactly. I
could you
fully
just
agree.
give your another big question, but what do you see Nietzsche's overall significance as? I mean, there's many interpretations of Nietzsche. Heidegger interpreted him metaphysically. Kaufman interprets him psychologically. Some people think he does have a political project. Other people say that he does not. I'm I'm a centrist on many of these issues. I've read so many interpretations of Nietzsche that I can kind of see the different perspective. I think it's very
Sure.
in keeping with his perspectivism to see that they're seeing these genuine angles on Nietzsche.
Yes.
But nevertheless, in the story of Western philosophy, it, what role do you see Nietzsche playing? Maybe that's a good way to put it.
I mean, this role, um, these many roles that you already mentioned, I also fully agree with what you said about Nietzsche, by the way.
Oh, good.
I also think that there are many Nietzsches. I mean, he makes
Mm,
many Versuche, attempts, as he says himself, right? He's like also taking on different voices and I like this triple meaning of Versuche. And he calls himself a Versucher, an attempter, right? And the word has a
mm,
triple meaning for Nietzsche, which is very clear. Trying out something, uh, but then versuchen also tempting, like tempting his readers, and
yeah.
like the devil is
Like seducing
tempting.
them. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exact seducing, right? And then it has the experimental thing, like
Mm,
a scientist, right? They make experiments, Versuche. So you just said that's not exactly the same as just trying something, right? Where you actually
mm,
make like a scientific experiment, because Nietzsche also very often takes on this kind of scientific attitude, which comes from the history of philosophy. That was German philosophy, like Hegel and Kant, they all saw themselves as scientists, right? And Nietzsche was himself also big into science, like not big interest in natural science and biology and all these kind of things, right? So you have this kind of scientific meaning of Versuche, you have the devilish, seductive meaning of it, and you just have this kind of playful trying out like in child play, right? And I
Could
think
I
that's
interject really quick that I think there's a contextual use of experiment in English that kind of conveys all three in a way, as when people say, I experimented with drugs in college, of like
yes, yes,
it's trying something, you're attempting something, it's kind of
yes,
childlike and playful, but
yes,
it's also transgressive and kind of bad.
excellent, yes,
Yeah.
yes, excellent, yes. And that's what Nietzsche does philosophically. He says so,
Mm,
right? And so there are all these different experimenting with different drugs that's that
yeah.
Nietzsche does, right? And so you can have all these readings, and all these readings that you mentioned are to an extent justified, or but of course, if you only focus on one, then that's basically the mistake you make,
Mm.
and prioritize one. Then you can't somehow miss the whole point. Um, if you isolate one from all others, prioritize, and then neglect all the others. Uh, but why we were talking, how did we get to this topic?
Oh, I guess, yeah. Is there? I mean, given that, is there nevertheless some way that you could define Nietzsche's role or how you see like his
In
significance
philosophy,
or
yes.
something? Yeah,
Well,
in
his
philosophy.
significance in philosophy, as you already said, is it came after his death, right? During his
Mm,
lifetime, basically, no one read his book. He was not influential during his lifetime on the history of philosophy at all. He wished he would have been, but he wasn't. And that only came basically the moment he died. He became like super famous all over the world. And then he had this immense influence on 20th century philosophy, and not just philosophy, literature, on psychoanalysis, right? That's Freud. Without Nietzsche, no Freud, no Jung, and whatever. He had this immense influence on postmodernism, and he had this immense influence on Nazism. He had this immense influence on Jordan Peterson, right? And he had an immense influence
right.
on Chinese writers, like famous writers like Lu Xun and so forth. So there are all these niches that all these attempts, all these seductive attempts, they all had after he died, they all came to fruition.
Why do you think that is? I've always thought it's just because to be glib about it, he's just such a damn good writer. And so
Yes,
everyone wants to kind of
and he's also a bad writer. I think he's both a very good and a very bad writer.
could you expand on that a bit?
I mean, I cannot read, and I admit this even in public, I never really fully read the Zarathustra. I
Oh, I
cannot
understand
read
that.
it. I
I understand
cannot.
that.
Yeah.
I
It's so
forced
bad.
myself,
The
but
writing is
yeah.
it's like cringe. That is so cringe to me. And that's why I suffer from it and I cannot
Mm,
read the whole thing. You have to read bits and pieces here and there if you want to
mm,
do something academically or want to teach and you have to check. But I cannot sit down like for an hour or two and read the Zarathustra.
yeah. Yeah, there that opinion was shared by some of his friends and contemporaries as well, which is funny. But I think it is because, just as far as the general experience of reading philosophy, you sit down and read Kant or Hegel, it's a much more enjoyable experience to read Nietzsche, and I sort of see many people of many different stripes almost trying to seize the power of his words or something like that and bring I want to have they all want to have Nietzsche on their side usually rather than as an object of he's the enemy or something like that. And so you have the most disparate political ideologies and philosophical ideologies trying to grab onto him, which is interesting.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And just to say that again, of course, I also think he's an absolutely brilliant writer. And like other books, I find they are like fantastic, right?
Mm.
So it's a big,
Right.
some of the seductions work like very, very
Right,
well
right,
for
right.
me, and the others don't work for me.
Yeah, Zarathustra could be a failed experiment, we might say. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, well, then, to kind of then begin comparing the two of Nietzsche and Zhuangzi, and you said this word earlier of Nietzsche's influence on the postmodernists. It's kind of a funny word to apply, especially with Zhuangzi, who's pre-modern. But I would say using postmodernism in sort of a very general, extended sense of this sort of critique of modernist theories of truth. To me,
Yes.
at least, that's where I see a huge overlap between Zhuangzi and Nietzsche.
Yes.
Is would you say it's fair to like we've always been postmodern, we've always had postmodernists? Is Zhuangzi, is it fair to include him in that milieu with Nietzsche?
Yes.
Yeah.
My colleague Günther Wohlfahrt called Nietzsche a pre-postmodernist.
Mm,
And he wrote a big book about Nietzsche and Heraclitus, German. And so this notion, I like this notion of pre-postmodernist for Nietzsche, right? He was very, very deeply entrenched in pre-Socratic philosophy. That's where he comes
mm,
from, classic studies and so forth. But he's also, so looking backwards, he's basically a pre-Socratic, right? Heraclitus
right.
and so forth. But looking forwards, he's also a postmodernist. So he
Mm,
was like a pre-postmodernist.
mm.
And you can say something similar, I would say, about Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi is also a pre-postmodernist, somewhere in between Heraclitus and Derrida.
Interesting. Yeah, what I'm interested in what you'll think about this because I've there's like sort of a parallel. I guess I've
And that
noticed.
is, sorry, again, I
Oh,
just want to
go
confirm what
ahead.
you said. That means, of course, that he's critical of the modernist thinking.
Hmm.
So
Yeah,
again, like I completely agree with you, right? This being Heraclitus and Derrida at the same time is the other side of the
right.
coin of being anti-modernism.
Is there actually this thought just came to mind before I get onto this? Is there some kind of connection, do you think, between authenticity and like the modernist theory of truth? Be,
Absolutely. Yes.
I, I don't think I've ever put that together before, but it seems like it's the same era in a way.
Yes,
Like if
absolutely. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It's the Enlightenment era, autonomy. Like, in order to be we have this cluster, authenticity is focused on individuality, autonomy, independence, originality. This is this whole cluster of authenticity. And that is very closely tied to modernism. Kant, for instance, Nietzsche is very critical, rightly so, of Kant and of the notion of autonomy. And so this autonomy, this is also Jordan Peterson, right? Modernist. He's also in
Mm.
many ways a modernist, right? This
Yeah.
autonomy and control and self-control and so forth, and creativity in that sense, right? The creative individual that then becomes autonomous and becomes somehow a master of his life, his for it's also very
Right.
manly.
Right.
And so this is modernist thinking, right? Again, Jordan Peterson, the sovereign individual, and that is this. How do you become a sovereign individual? But you need to be enlightened, autonomous, and then you're in control rather than being
Right.
controlled. And only in this way can you be authentic, not alienate. So that this whole age of authenticity and this notion of sovereignty and autonomy, they are together. And of course, Nietzsche um, um, deconstructs all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is the parallel I've noticed, and I'm wondering what you would think. So we have this idea in Confucianism with the rectification of names. And what I've kind of drawn out of that is that he's zeroing in on the moral element in naming, so that if we don't call something by the right name, society's not going to function. Rituals aren't going to flourish, the laws aren't going to be enforced, people won't know how to act. And so there's sort of like a telos expressed in the name. It doesn't just
Yes,
indicate a state of affairs; it indicates how things ought to be. And I see a
yes,
similarity
exactly.
with Nietzsche's understanding of, I guess you would say, like our conventional metaphysical ideas, whether you call them Christian or Platonist or idealist or whatever. And so, like for example, he has the essay on truth and lies in the non-moral sense. He says we
Yes,
value truthfulness because it's an agreement to use the usual code of signifiers because of the moral and the regulative importance that it has. Or in Twilight of Idols, where he's talking about we come to this idea of being because we want to hold people responsible. And so, in a way, I see that as a key element of, I guess, both Zhuangzi and Nietzsche's postmodernism.
yes,
Is
yes.
I know it's not a direct parallel, but it was just interesting that there's this thing about sort of how we name things and how or Nietzsche would talk about conceptual unities and things like that.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely. I think again you hit the nail on the head there. Um, we have the same thing like in Nietzsche, not exactly the same thing. It's completely different historical context.
Mm,
But as you said, Nietzsche, the critique of the concept, die Vorurteile der Philosophen, the prejudices of
mm,
the prejudices of the philosophers, which focus on these conceptual things. And then we have these words, we have the language, where we're like Nietzsche talks so much about how we are kind of deceived by the language that we use. And then we invent a term, and then we take this term like truth and so forth to be essential, right? And so he's this deconstructing this in a postmodern way. He shows how truth are exactly basically is a form of lie, right?
mm,
The truth is like comes from lying, is a derivative of lying. And
right.
so how all these concepts are actually rooted genealogically in their opposite. And that
Mm,
is very, very similar to what Zhuangzi does. He's also critiquing this kind of belief in, let's say, the essentiality of conceptual ideas. And he shows, like the postmodernists do, that they all entail basically their opposite. That's what I said in the beginning, the critique of the hypocrisy, right?
mm,
Uh, that all this the Confucian moral vocabulary very, very similar to Nietzsche, is basically based on immorality, not
right.
just on amorality. That the core of the Confucian moral vocabulary is its opposite.
Right. The passage in Beyond Good and Evil where he says that it could even be possible that all the greatest virtues and truth and beauty and goodness have arisen from their opposite,
Yes,
even as their refinement or something like this. Um,
yes, exactly. Yeah,
but that's interesting because with Nietzsche, hmm, I've always the sense I get with Nietzsche is that and this is a bit heretical to say, that he has a sort of like sublative goal that he kind of wants to. move beyond the Enlightenment, or consciousness has all these flaws and pathologies, but he imagines sort of like a new form of consciousness, and the perhaps represented by the Overman or what have you,
Yes,
that
yeah,
would be free from guilt and the bad conscience and ressentiment
yes,
and all these things.
yeah.
I don't necessarily get that sense with Zhuangzi that that there's anything to that there's any sort of task to complete or anything like that. Maybe that speaks to one of the differences between them, or perhaps you see it a different way.
Yeah, you don't really have this, as you rightfully said, this emphasis on the future, post-human, superhuman, or whatever. And that's frankly something I also don't really like in Nietzsche. That's another thing I'm not really a big fan of in Nietzsche. This theme, this attempt, this seduction. But it is very prominent. It's a big theme, no doubt, in Nietzsche's writings. Um, the parallel there is, and you don't, as you said again, I fully agree with you. You don't really have that vision of the future in Taoism. You have a vision of the past, which is, as we already discussed, right? This return motive is very strong in Taoism, already in the Lao Tzu Tao Te Ching, return. But then again, this is also figurative. So if anything, in Taoism, it's not future but past
Right.
oriented. You have this again theme. Again, there's a complex theme, but that's a difference between Nietzsche and
Right.
Taoism. But the perhaps maybe even the biggest parallel. We already discussed many parallels between Zhuangzi and Nietzsche, but for me, maybe the most important, the most central, the most obvious parallel is, and that has to do with what you just said, is the focus on health, on
Mm.
health. So Nietzsche regards Nietzsche is has this approach to diagnostic approach, right? He sees the history of philosophy, the history of culture, the whole genealogy has produced great sickness. That is if not the, it is a main, very, very main theme in Nietzsche, right? Why does he do these deconstructions, right? Everything we talked about, because he regards this whole um, dismantling as a kind of a diagnostic project, right? And this distinction between sickness and health, great health and great sickness, I think is very, very central to reading Nietzsche, right? So, and the vision, Nietzsche's vision of the future is a vision of health, a vision that in the future there we might somehow overcome sickness, and the sickness that has been bred into us, breeding, right? We have been over this whole history of our philosophy and civilization and culture, we have basically cultivated a very deeply seated sickness. And the future is a vision of overcoming this and achieving some form of health. And the same kind of dichotomy is, I would say, clearly at work in Taoism. And that's not an original hypothesis. One of the scholars, I don't know if he's still alive, Norman Girardot, elderly scholar, said something like, and this has been very influential on me, this one sentence. He wrote a very nice book about Ziran, but anyways, Hundun, he calls the essence of Taoism as a whole medicinal. It's a
Mm.
medicinal tradition. And that is true very much for what is called religious Taoism, which is about achieving long life and having all these bodily physical practices. That is the center of what is called the religious tradition, is to achieve bodily and spiritual health to the highest possible extent. But in the Zhuangzi, I would say it's about achieving not so, and that's also already there in the Laos of this topic. The emphasis shifts to something what I would call sanity. That is more again existential and sociopolitical health, some form of a state of ease rather than a state of unease. And we have in the Zhuangzi this very, very central notion of xiao yao you, which is also carefree wandering, the name of my channel.
Yeah.
And so to achieve this kind of ease as opposed to unease, and to achieve this kind of carefreeness, I think that is to see that as like the major um, distinction, which kind of
Right.
underlies most of the philosophical attempts, be it sociopolitical, moral critique, and so forth. And I think that is the biggest parallel between Nietzsche and Zhuangzi, that they
Right.
both operate with this basic distinction of sickness and health, and that basically all of their different attempts um, uh, uh, have as their kind of main starting point this difference, and that also applies to the difference between the perspective to the future and the
Mm.
perspective towards the past. Because for Nietzsche, the what is it's never really clear what this superhuman, post-human, whatever
Right.
thing is. But one thing it is a time of great health, and that is also the kind of the utopian vision of the past that you find in Taoism, that it was a time of great virtue in the non-moral sense,
Right.
in the pre-moral sense. And that is also the what is the superhuman? If anything, it is the virtuous person in the non-moral sense, the virtuous person that they have great that they have great power and health. That's all there is to the uh, to uh, to the superhuman, I think.
Right. Well, first, I ask, what is it that you find disagreeable about the future-oriented nature of Nietzsche's philosophy,
Well,
or
again, it's like closely tied to the Zarathustra, right?
mm,
And it has this also for me somewhat cringy Christian thing, right?
mm,
That it's like this antichrist, it's kind of the messianic aspect of it. That's what I want to say,
right,
right? It shares this Christian messianic vocabulary. It's deeply ironic, I think, in Nietzsche, right, as a whole antichrist. And but yeah, this kind of inheriting and then exaggerating to an extent, even this messianistic. Do I pronounce this correctly? Uh,
messianic, yeah,
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 messianic. Yes, thank you.
yeah,
This kind of it's against my taste. It
right.
doesn't. It's not my taste.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like you have an eschaton or you have like a savior figure, and it is
Yes.
interesting because there are times in Nietzsche's notes you can find in Will to Power where he's almost there's one that comes to mind where he's coming up with all of the beneficial things that Christianity did. It gives us a meaning for our suffering. It tells us that we
Yeah.
know what values are, and all of these things. And it's as if he's then trying to replace those functions with the new religion, but now it's a worldly religion instead of an otherworldly religion. Um, Whereas with Zhuangzi, I guess what it is that it seems like Zhuangzi is not as interested in sort of a revaluation of values and sort of this grand project in the future. Um, at least to it seems as if maybe it's something that would happen. Maybe you could still call it a revaluation on the individual level if you have some sort of insight into the transformative nature of things. But yeah, I don't really get that impression that he's aiming for something like that.
The big parallel is the focus on health as
Mm.
opposed to sickness. This kind of dichotomy between health and sickness.
How would you say Zhao Yaoyo and Amor Fati? Is that the comparison you would make to Nietzsche, or would there be something else?
Um, I mean, Xiaoyaoyou is, as I said, is ease and Nietzsche gay science. It's gay.
Mm,
It's
okay.
this
Yeah.
fröhlich, the to be in a state of joy.
Mm,
But again, there's a big difference between, let's say, the 19th, 20th century Western joy and the Taoist joy. Like my teacher in Bonn back last century, he would say that the make this distinction between the Western approach, which is always ecstatic, ecstatic, and the Chinese approach is much more enstatic, enstase. Like it's like this kind of calmness and relaxedness, and which is the opposite of ecstasy, right? You're in a stage of complete relaxation, right? You have it,
Mm,
whatever, imagine like whatever, a Zen Buddhist meditational state later on, because Zen Buddhism has a lot to do. They very much
right.
rely on tradition
Although
comes
they're
from
always hitting each
Taoism.
other and screaming, so I don't know
Yeah,
exactly
yeah, they
how
do
at
that
ease the
too,
Zen
of
masters
course,
are.
but it's not like an ecstatic, like we were talking
Right, right,
earlier
right.
about the drug experiments. So they take different kinds of drugs, very different kind of drug.
Right, right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and that speaks to, I think I love what you said about health being the key thing, and I don't think I'd drawn that particular parallel. And it makes perfect sense when I think about religious Taoism, the way you were bringing it up too. That's where I think there's like a this physiological focus that comes through more maybe in Nietzsche's philosophy than in the Taoist philosophy,
Right.
but definitely is there in the religion. But with the ecstasis versus instasis um, issue, it brings to mind to me another sort of potential contrast because, and maybe it's just an apparent contrast, maybe it's just aesthetic or the level of vibes, right? But Nietzsche is often speaking in the language of force and activity,
Right.
will to power, you know, and in
Right.
Zhuangzi, where you have this idea of being non-active, uh,
Exactly.
you know, so many passages about being the advantages of being useless in
Exactly.
the Zhuangzi. Is
Exactly.
this a real tension or is it an apparent one? I mean, I know can we see the kind of overall uh, congeniality between these philosophers, but there does seem to be this difference in their emphasis.
Yeah, there's a completely different vibe, as we could say, different vibe. But of course, it has to do with the cultural and historical differences,
Okay,
right? And again, Nietzsche comes from Romanticism and comes from you even have in Christianity, you have that kind of this ecstasy in the Protestant tradition. I mean, think about evangelical Christianity and so, and also Hegel talks about this, right? And the kind of enthusiasm, also the word has theos in it, God in it, right? Is you're
right.
possessed by God, and then in this enthusiastic state. So this kind of enthusiasm is also very much can be felt in Nietzsche, this enthusiastic element. And that is not, we don't have a theos in Taoism. We don't have a
Mm,
God. And we don't have the enthusiastic element in Taoism. So I do think that has even a lot to do. Nietzsche is still Christian in having this enthusiastic, strong element. And that is not really present in Taoism. There's something else. And that has probably to do with the difference between the monotheistic tradition that Nietzsche comes from and the non-monotheistic, non-theistic at all approach that you see in Taoism.
mm. Yeah, but
Uh,
nevertheless, there is sort of an idea, I guess, in Zhuangzi that, and in Lao Tzu, certainly, probably more so in Lao Tzu, that it's more effective to be inactive. Whereas
exactly. Yeah.
whereas with Nietzsche, I get the sense
To be
that
chilled. I mean, it's not inactive. It's, inactive. Do
to be
nothing so that nothing remains undone.
mm,
There's a very, very strong emphasis on being effective in
right,
Taoism. It's not about doing nothing, it's about being most effective. But you're most effective in a non when you're in a non-enthusiastic state. That is the whole thing. When you're in
okay,
a complete
right,
relaxed state, when things function automatically, when you're in the flow, whatever, right? This state of that's again modern concept, somewhat new age, but the flow is a good metaphor because it relates to water and so forth, and the flow of water, and that is, I think, a good metaphor for describing this state of ease, like whatever you're a long distance runner and then you get into the flow, or to give all these modern examples that, of course, also completely anachronistic. There was no long
Right.
distance running in the Zhuangzi. But, anyways, this kind of notion of flow. If we want to use our contemporary language,
Or
that comes kind of close, I guess, to what
the
Xiao is.
butcher, cook, the butcher
Yeah, but
Ding.
the butcher story again, that brings us
Yeah.
another topic. But this
Oh, okay. I
notion of
gotcha.
flow is there, and in the butcher story, there's even the notion of yo. The knife is yoing in the butcher story.
Hmm.
So you're in this sense, you're correct. Though I have actually a very political interpretation of that story, and I don't think the butcher is a good guy. I think he's a bad guy. I think he's a
Oh.
bad Daoist. But then we can have another conversation on the butcher story.
Yeah.
But generally, yes, exactly. That is correct. So
I mean,
it's in the butcher story too, the flow.
I'm interested now. Could you give me the elevator pitch for why he's a bad Taoist?
Because it's completely incongruous. If you have like a description on your video,
Okay.
I have animated version on my other channel, Philosophy in Motion, where I have animated stories of the Zhuangzi. And if anyone is interested in seeing my interpretation of the butcher story, they should watch
Okay.
this animated version of the story. Anyways, shortly, I also think it's a political critique, right? We have the butcher slaughtering an oxen,
Mm.
brutal. It's a completely incongruent story. The butcher is showing the king how to slaughter an oxen, and basically it's a political critique of the regimes at the time who were also engaged in massive slaughter
Mm.
of humans. And I do think this is a critique. Also, I read it as a basically a critique of a sellout Taoism for the perpetuation
Mm.
of of the um, the feudal regimes.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna have to look that up. I'll definitely put that in the description. Bringing this into sort of like real world implications or like everyday implications. In the modern world, it's very different from the Confucian world, I guess, would be one way of putting it. For at least for those of us in the West, I know in many Asian countries, Confucianism is still very much alive and well. But for those of us who have, mentioning that Zhuangzi is sort of like a pre-modern figure, for those of us who have gone through the modern age, modernist theory of truth, age of authenticity, what does Zhuangzi offer us? I mean, if those things are sort of, we might say, Nietzsche might call them errors. Maybe they were particularly useful errors at a particular point in time. What does Zhuangzi offer us in the way of overcoming those errors? What does he say to us about overcoming authenticity, or would you see it in those terms?
Again, I mean, I can only repeat myself. It is through the genuine pretending thing, right? I regard both, by the way, Zhuangzi and Nietzsche as therapeutic rather than normative philosophers. And I think that is a very important distinction. So, I can
But it,
also only answer yeah, sorry,
but
go ahead.
it seems to me that the issue that people are facing nowadays is not so much that they're locked into roles, if
No,
that makes sense.
no, now they're
There
locked
might,
into profiles.
right, well, true. But I guess what I'm saying is that there's no, it seems to me that there isn't, like many people might actually want some kind of role. I think you speak to why there's
Sure,
people who are looking backwards to sort of like
sure,
romantic return and these sorts of things.
sure,
They would almost prefer sincerity to the sort of individualist
sure,
atomization and these sorts
sure,
of things.
sure,
And it seems to me that many people might read Zhuangzi, if I can put the question more critically, and say, well, this is just sort of nothing. It doesn't really give me anything to grab onto. And in fact, I think in the text, Huizi sort of complains about that to Zhuangzi himself. He compares his philosophy to his useless tree and says, your words are all crooked and strange and no one knows how to make use of them. And I guess I'm defeating the premise of my question even here of saying, how do we make use of it? But
Mm.
I guess I'm just wondering, like in the context we're in now, it strikes me that many people might wish to even have a role, but they don't have one. And we're
Well,
so.
again, like in my philosophy, I would say they want to have a profile, not a role. But
Mm,
anyways, I agree with you, and I see your point. Again, like first of all, I think we have to understand that both Nietzsche and Zhuangzi are therapeutic rather than normative. So it's not that they, have some form of normative system that they are kind of establishing, no ideology or so, no like whatever uh, vision of this is how society should ideally be, and these are the values that are good and the other values that are bad, or something like this. I don't think there is such a kind of a normative. I don't think that's a good reading of either of the two. Anyway, so what does therapeutic mean? Again, it's both for Nietzsche and for Zhuangzi. It means to achieve some form of health. And society is very stressful, and no matter which age you're in, if you're in the age of roles, of sincerity, or if you're in the age of authenticity, or if you're in the age nowadays of profiles, of profilicity, the point is simply to kind of understand the kind of the identity pressures and the other social pressures that are forced upon us through the social political systems we're in, and through the philosophical and religious heritage we have inherited, that through our that we are like the genealogical situation we are in, and that is somewhat similar again to Buddhism, we are that they are interested in a diagnosis of the causes of suffering, and then specifically in how can we achieve some form of well-being. And that is not in the sense of Jordan Peterson's self-help thing. It's more like, do this, do that, 12 rules for life or so. You won't really find that in Taoism. At least I don't think so. It's more like, let's say, achieving some form of critical attitude, ironic attitude,
mm,
that allows you, and not just individually. This is also very important for Zhuangzi, right? He's not an individualist, and that is actually in which Taoism is somewhat similar to Confucianism. And then now humor comes in, right? Be in good humor, in the
mm,
sense of like achieving some form, as hopefully even we now in this conversation had, a
right.
form of productive togetherness, in which we can play around intellectually with the things we like. For me, the key story about this is the Happy Fish story, which
Mm,
I also have animated, so you can put that link there as well. And we as philosophers, we can do this in philosophy, as we have right now, right?
mm,
To achieve like a moment where we are both in a form of xiao yao yo, where we mutually feel we are doing something productive, and at the same time we forget somehow the fact that we are operating on YouTube, and that this is a horrible exploitative
mm,
thing that we're in all the time, and we cannot but operate within it. Just like in ancient China, we are in our profiles right now, you and I. We
mm,
cannot escape them. There is not this escapism in
right.
Taoism. It's not about we're not going, we're in the midst of society right now, in the midst of this system that causes all the pressuring that is so exploitative and horrible. And yet, you and I, right now, through our conversation, are capable of achieving some form of xiao yao yao of ease. We didn't have a script. We're not thinking about the followers and so forth. And nevertheless, we are capable about having some form, at least I, right now, of mutual enjoyment of the situation. And we don't follow the 12 rules for life of this, like, right? And we're not obsessed with these things either.
Mm,
And yeah, that's simple, but that's what Taoism is about. And we achieve it through being critical. And we
mm,
achieve it through, at the same time, not taking, in this case, our profiles too seriously, while at the same time we're within them.
mm. Yeah, that sort of answers what was going to be my final question of what. these figures would think of prophilicity. But it sounds like you're saying throw yourself into it. That is the situation. And
Yes.
there may be something even in Nietzsche about, yeah, there's a line from Nietzsche I really love at the end of the preface to The Gay Science, where he says, those Greeks knew how to live. They lived in appearance and they affirmed appearance. They were superficial out
Yes.
of profundity.
Yes.
And
Yes.
thinking about what you've said about prophilicity, being superficial out of profundity seems like a perhaps more long-winded, but a good analogy to genuine pretending, a phrase from Nietzsche. I'm not exactly sure what the German is, but
I like the story of the diver in the Zhuangzi, right? The Confucius walks to some famous waterfall, and he sees this diver diving down there. Normally, he would die something like Niagara Falls or something like this, right? And then
mm,
nothing happens. The diver comes out, and then Confucius sends a student and asks, actually thinks he's dead and wants to kind of get the student to get the corpse. But the diver just nothing happened to him. He just walks out of the water naked. And then he says, and then the student asks him, "Do you have some form of Tao?" Right?
mm,
And the diver says, "No, I don't have any Tao. You know, I grew up in the land and I was comfortable in the land, and eventually I got used to the water, and now I'm comfortable in the water." And the
mm,
water is again like we are in this hostile environment. We're in this deadly environment, right?
mm.
And we just have to be able to achieve some form of ease and productivity and virtue, power within this kind of lethal environment that we're always in, and that's the Taoist existential situation and question.
That's very well put.
And that's also the case with prophilicity. And nevertheless, we can have some form of productive joy.
I certainly have. I've certainly been my pleasure to have you on the show. And before we sign off here, do you have anything that you're working on that's coming up that you wanted to shout
Oh,
out?
yeah, I have a new book coming out.
Oh,
It's on
wonderful.
gender. It's called The Enigma of Gender. And yeah, it's
Will
about
that
this identity technologies applied to gender,
apply to
sincerity,
gender?
authenticity, and prophilicity, how they shape gender identity. And it's also a cultural critique and a Taoist approach to the current
Hmm.
gender wars.
I was going to say, it sounds like it might anger Dr. Peterson. So,
Well,
uh,
so be it.
I would say so much the better. But Professor Moeller, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful conversation.
Yes, very good.
Signing
Thank you.
off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.